Publius Cornelius Tacitus was an upper-class aristocrat and civil official in the Roman Empire. His renowned work, Germania, is the oldest preserved account of the Germanic people. It's unlikely that Tacitus ever traveled among the Germans, but armed with earlier, now lost, written and oral accounts, he provided an exceedingly accurate description of the nature of the Germanic people. At the time, pure-blooded Nordic Germans stretched from Scandinavia down to southern Germany and from Belgium to Poland, yet very little was known about their folk ways due to their warlike nature and impenetrable terrain. First, the physical peculiarities. Tacitus opines that the tribes of Germany are free from all taint of intermarriages with foreign nations, and that they appear as a distinct, unmixed race, like none but themselves. Modern genetics have proven Tacitus's opinion to be grounded in solid fact. Natives of Scandinavia and the Baltics genetically represent the Germans that Tacitus would have known, the pure German race. Interestingly, Scandinavians and Balts are the most distinct European populations, clustering the furthest from other races on a PCA chart. Since the time of Tacitus, modern Germans, particularly in the East and South, accumulated some Slavic and Latin DNA through various invasions, yet still show a higher amount of genetic distance from African and Asian populations than do other European groups. All of this lends credence to Tacitus's opinion that Germans are a unique, unmixed race. The next observation that Tacitus makes is the physical appearance of the Germans, writing, "All have fierce blue eyes, red hair, huge frames, fit only for a sudden exertion." It seems that the original word Tacitus used, rutile, has been slightly mistranslated and probably meant all light hair shades. As you can probably guess, this observation reigns true to this day. The highest percentages of light hair and eyes are found in the same Baltic and Scandinavian populations, fading away as you move further from the North Sea. It may not come as a surprise that Nordic people have the highest prevalence of light hair and eyes, but some might be skeptical of the idea that Germans are particularly tall or fit only for a sudden exertion. Science, however, proves this to be a fact as well. Here's a chart of average male height in Europe. Admittedly, the Balkans complicate things a bit, but the point still stands. In regards to being fit only for a sudden exertion, the science is inconclusive. There are a variety of genetic factors, such as muscle fiber type, bone density, and overall body size that have a complicated relationship to strength. The best proof we can look to for a Nordic propensity for sudden exertion is in the World's Strongest Man competition. Held for the last 47 years, the World's Strongest Man is an international strongman competition where contestants lift tremendously heavy objects, usually for a very brief period of time. Since it began in 1977, every winner, as well as second and third place finishers, have been Nordic men, hailing from a dozen or so countries. Some might say that this is because of cultural factors. Other cultures don't put as much of an emphasis on strongman competitions, they might say. To that, I would point out the fact that American and Canadian whites, despite hailing from all over Europe, are largely culturally assimilated. Despite that fact, there appears to be no Mediterranean winners. Rather, the only winners from North America seem to be whites with a Nordic background. Take a look at this chart here and pay attention to the surnames of North American whites. Clearly, there's something about the genetics of Nordic people that makes them excel at powerlifting and being NFL linemen while failing to compete at elite levels in other athletic disciplines. From the beginning, the Germans were a freedom-loving people. Kings were chosen by birth, but generals were chosen by merit and led by example, not arbitrary power. Leaders fought from the front and were admired because of it. Important matters were deliberated by the whole tribe, which tied the community together and certainly had its downsides. Tacitus writes, "Their freedom has this disadvantage, that they do not meet simultaneously, or as they are bidden, but 2 or 3 days are wasted in the delays of assembling." There is much to lament about the inefficiencies of modern democracy, but there is something particularly Germanic about persevering in the face of it for the sake of freedom. Tacitus then goes on to explain the warrior culture of the Germans in detail. The German soldiers used simple, multi-purpose weapons and fought naked or lightly clad. Their chief strength was in the infantry, with particularly fast youths recruited to be on the front lines. Tacitus writes, "Their infantry, which fights along with the cavalry, admirably adapted to the action of the latter, is the swiftness of certain foot soldiers, who are picked from the entire youth of their country and stationed in front of the line." To give ground with the intention of returning to the attack was seen as prudence, not cowardice, but abandoning your shield altogether was seen as the basest of crimes, and men thus disgraced were banned from attending sacred rites and entering the council. Much of the Germans' fighting strength lies in the fact that squadrons were composed of families and clans. Soldiers often had their women and children nearby to tend to their wounds and remind them of the unacceptable outcome of defeat, which would lead to the horrors of captivity for those they held dearest. When reading Tacitus's account of the all-encompassing weapons culture, I couldn't help but think about white American gun culture. Tacitus writes, "They conduct no public or private business without being armed." He goes on to explain how approval was conveyed in public meetings, writing, "When the multitude think proper, they sit down armed. If his sentiments, chief/king, displease them, they reject them with murmurs. If they are satisfied, they brandish their spears. The most complimentary form of assent is to express approbation with their weapons." Weapons had a symbolic importance in ancient Germania. Young men were not allowed to bear arms until they were recognized by the state or their kinsmen in a rite of passage. Once they were allowed to bear arms, they were no longer seen as members of the household, but rather members of the commonwealth. Husbands brought a dowry to their future wives, but it was not in the form of gold or land, rather instruments of war, such as shields, swords, or saddled steeds. This meant to convey the importance of war, the notion being that passing these things on was the most important. The Germans saw war not only as a necessity, they also rejoiced in it, despite the fact that soldiers' only pay was in the form of feasts and entertainment. During prolonged feasts, noble youths would seek out war, as inaction is perilous to their race, according to Tacitus. They saw farming as tame and stupid, and preferred to plunder by blood. Youths could win renown more steadily in the midst of peril than they could anywhere on the domestic front. When not fighting, they spent most of their time hunting, sleeping, and feasting, allowing women and disabled men to manage their households. Finally, the Germans believed that women have a saintly presence and did not despise their counsels. Tacitus writes that their marriage is strict, and indeed no part of their manners is more praiseworthy. Almost alone among barbarians, they are content with one wife. Clandestine correspondence leading to adultery was very rare, and killing or otherwise limiting your number of descendants was extremely taboo. Mothers breastfed their own children, never leaving the duty to servants, and men and women married late, leaving the vigor of young men unimpaired. Of course, modern Germanic nations are infamous for having virulent feminism and old ages at first birth. It seems that here a noble instinct has been weaponized to the detriment of the Germanic people. In conclusion, Tacitus's Germania is an enlightening account of the customs and peculiarities of the German people, and it is easy to make many of the same observations today, despite 2,000 years having passed. The German Adenauer, famously depicted in Indiana Jones' Raiders of the Lost Ark, were fascinated by the account and tried to gain possession of a famous medieval copy. Germania will continue to fascinate readers for centuries to come, as it is a strikingly prophetic account of German political and cultural developments long after Tacitus's time, and will continue to shape the future of the world so long as the German race remains.